Okay, so network migration. Now, networks can form in a variety of ways. We learned already about how the Bracero recruitment programs in Mexico for World War II harvest laborers brought young men to the United States seasonally with their uh, trip expenses paid and already an employer, and then they went back at the end of the time period. And you could just have that kind of migration go on for quite a while without any real permanent community migration. And in fact, there was just a lot of seasonal migration for decades, mostly of that origin through World War II's end and into the 60s, as we learn. Now, what I want to describe here, though, is a kind of migration that isn't from some kind of international labor recruitment, if you're looking at the very top of the sheet here, but rather it's a more kind of almost a spontaneous kind of migration that happens usually. Well, a story that comes to mind that might help you follow this is the story about Juan. So sorry about that little blip there. The story about Juan and From One Man a Channel. It is just a delightful story about network migration. And it happened in an area where people weren't really being recruited internationally. So, what I want to do is talk about that story. I'm not going to fill in these blanks for you literally with my mouse, but you should be able to pretty much do this after you listen to this discussion. And I'm going to, as I talk, you'll pretty much see that I'm addressing those various columns running across the top of that grid in terms of what's happening over time. So let's talk about it. Okay. So you might get that, by the way, as you listen to this, you might want to stop the video and just go get the article or that was basically a chapter in a book and maybe have it in front of you again and maybe even just kind of do a quick scan through it again to remember the details. So I'm going to flesh out a whole bunch of details here uh, in that story that should help us understand this. Okay, so as we know, Juan was kind of like the first member in his community that migrated out, except there were a couple of sisters that he had the contact number of who had worked, as you might recall. Who were they working for? Remember that story? So they were working for an American woman who was in Guatemala City for a while. And then she moves back to Houston, Texas. Okay. And when she goes back, it turns out that the young women who were doing housework for her, she managed to convince them to come uh, and work for her in Houston. Now, there's probably other women that would do housework in Houston that were already there, but she had a relationship with them, and relationships are really important in understanding how these kind of things get rolling, right? We don't really know anything more than that, other than that Juan eventually gives them a call because he had their phone number and they helped him kind of get set up a little bit. So they gave him some orientation, right? So if we think about Juan at this stage, and by the way, why did he go? It wasn't like he just said, "Oh, I think I want to work in the United States." He had a serious problem, didn't he? What was the issue? Okay, so go back and look for that if you don't remember it. And that stimulated him to migrate out to earn some wages that he couldn't possibly earn back in Guatemala. And in fact, world systems theory helps us sort of understand that part of the story too, because the experience already having done wage labor in an American owned factory in Guatemala, from that, Juan learned about wage labor and realized that this was something that had a little more, seemed to have a little more stability and security, better than selling stuff that he makes in a market or trying to whack out a little bit of a living from the farmland that he had. So Juan is, though, he's low knowledge, isn't he? He doesn't really know much about the trip. And so because of that, he he makes some mistakes along the way, and not knowing what he needs to do, those mistakes are costly. And so, who can have the kind of resources that Juan has? He's much above average. He's not your very poorest of poor, landless, rural peasant. He's somebody who was kind of seems sort of middle class. He has some land he owns, has some skills. Um, and so he manages to migrate out in a setting where very few people in his community could have done that. So he was already kind of exceptional. Yes, I'm talking about social class here. And so, in this kind of the thing, would a young woman leave in a setting like this? Well, maybe, but it would be discouraged, especially in those days. Nowadays, with the asylum seekers coming north, not as much so. But their kind of stimulus is different in some ways too. They're fleeing for their lives. In this case, well, he's sort of fleeing for someone else's life, as you know. He's going literally going to help someone else out, and you need to kind of remember that story. Try and remind you of it. So, are you going to do this first time if you're 50 years old? Probably not. Uh, what if you're a 12-year-old? If you're the first person out of your community, probably not either. So it gives you a sense of the parameters there. Who's going to migrate? What's their gender? Probably most of them, at least, and so on. Okay. And so this is a newly forming network that he starts basically. And so now you know the first row, don't you? Okay. From what I've said. Now, what happens through time? He goes and he works in this supermarket called Randall's in Gulfton area, and they have a whole bunch of these in Texas and Houston, particularly, which is a global city. And there's been a situation where the housing has gotten cheaper there after an oil boom. Boy, we're in one of those situations again, the oil bust. Texas is reeling right now for low oil prices again. It kind of history repeats itself, doesn't it? Um, so he is a good worker, and the Randall's supermarket people are interested in more workers like them who are willing to work hard, don't complain. Um, and so he ends up helping. He brings other people with him basically through the contacts that he has, and they come north as well. So this in the after a number of years, we start to see maybe 5 to 10 years, we see some flows coming that are pretty large, and it is a male worker thing probably still, but not 100%. Even maybe in the newer phase, it's not 100% male, but it's still probably dominantly male or almost 50-50, somewhere in there. And now, well, the maturing, people know more now because the people who've gone before them, like Juan, have made some mistakes. And from that knowledge, that changes the way they handle risks. They have a lot more information about who to go, who to go with, where to go, what to avoid, the best routes, the worst routes, and of course that stuff is updated regularly in the communication between people. And the more information you have, so then that lower risk also means lower costs to some degree. And who can migrate now? Now Juan is, a pretty well off guy, really locally, isn't he? Okay, it may not seem that way to you, but this is Guatemala, as you saw in the documentary this week. It is a very poor country, the rural Mayan Guatemalans especially. So social class here. By the time we're into maybe more of a maturing network where there's been 5, 10 years or so, these folks now don't have to have resources because the people that went before them do have the resources, right? And so they are able to help out. And in doing that, um, they loan the money. They have a place for them to stay. You don't have to bring a lot of cash anymore. So these can be purely working class rural laborers. They're wage earning folks, working class people, mostly probably not middle class, although some probably would go in that group too. But you don't have to be. So maturing, then it really is as this network starts to mature, some more and more people are coming, and maybe still dominantly, as we said, male laborers, but there's also females. And now, when males come with females, guess what? Mm-hmm. Sometimes they, well, maybe they want their children with them. Imagine that, huh? Just like anyone would. And so, if they can afford to, and this goes back to the 80s, of course, in this story, but if they can afford to do this, then they start bringing children. So now we got a range of ages, and maybe even grandma comes since things got a little more comfortable, and maybe she can take care of the kids too. See, so the ages change. They really broaden out from just kind of the young or the male workers, young adult, kind of late maybe teens through 30s. So now we're talking about a broader age group here. Okay, so then um, we, 10, 15 years, depending on the way networks form, we're at well, a well-established network, the one that we read about in From One Man a Channel, isn't it? And they're old hands at it. They know the ropes. They know how to get fake immigration cards. They know where to get the employment. They know where to live. They know all the tricks. They know the best routes, the best coyotes, the cheapest way to do it. Some of them are now legalized so they can fly back and forth. And we're, of course, entering an age eventually in this story where people are able to communicate via cell phones by the 90s. And so that helps communication too. And of course, nowadays it's internet and social media, a whole nother world, right? So all of that is a kind of cumulative causation in a way that helps flow thousands of people from this community. Okay. And all of this, the risk of apprehension of folks, there's still risks, but maybe about as low as you can imagine them for those who are undocumented. Probably now they have well-established border smugglers, coyotes, or polleros, depending on which terms you like, people who help you get across. And most of this would be community network people or people that the community network connects to that do that. So the cost overall on average probably is a little less unless there's been some other changes, but everything else being equal. And social class now again, it's masses. Everyone can go. Very often, though, these kind of labor networks do take on a laborer class or working class character, and sometimes the people of middle class status, the teachers, some of the people have a little more for professional training, might not want to go north because they well, that's something the working class people do. I've seen this in some Mexican networks. Sometimes you'll see that. In fact, the community my wife grew up in, there were people in her community who said, no, 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 we don't work in the United States, as if that were somehow for the other people, the not so well off people. So you have a little bit of that happening sometimes too. And so now all ages, from newborns or even pregnant women with children on the way, all the way into grandparents, in some cases, if they're younger and stronger and so on, they have a well-established network. Okay. And so this whole thing is made possible by social capital. Social capital. What is that? It's who you know, and then from that, what they know that gets you what you need so that you can make the trip and be successful as a laborer. So that's a grand story, one of the more amazing ones that I've ever read. By the way, there are networks that come to Middle Willamette Valley that are kind of like this. There's a place in Michoacan called Las Zarquillas, which has sent probably half of all the residents born there in the last 40 years have migrated out to much of it in the central Willamette Valley. Okay, and maybe I'll bet you that there's students at Western Oregon University. In fact, I know for a fact there are who are part of that community network. So it's kind of like the Juan story, except that network started, I believe, during the Bracero years. It wasn't more of a spontaneous migrations like Juan was from. Remember, Juan is not from Mexico, right? He's from the country south, which we call Guatemala. Okay, so I hope that helps you, and you can fill that out, and maybe a question or two on a quiz, maybe on the big quiz, could come from that. Hope this helps.